the caucuses.
At least it wasn't snow.
I thought I heard that.
I'm good.
Hi. We'll figure it out.
So you have, this is the one for, we put one aside today, right, this is like a Ross, but that's you, so you pick one. Okay, so we'll return this, okay, perfect. Of course, we were just like trying to figure out what we were done. Thank you.
The thing is, once they move there, you'll have risk. They have a whole wall of beef jerky.
All right, it is 4 o'clock.
They have vegetarian beef jerky.
I'd like to start on time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for pivoting after Tuesday's terrible weather. Thank you so much to Jill and Kathy and everyone for working out what to do. We wanted to keep you all safe, and we really appreciate you changing to come here now, because it was really important that we get back on Jill's schedule, because she's touring all over the place for this book. So we really wanted to have her here because we were so excited to launch it. So yay for coming back to this. Thank you all for being here. My name is Maggie Robe. I'm the Marketing and Events Manager here at Flyleaf. And yes, thank you for purchasing your book from us and coming and supporting us, because without you supporting us, we can't have programs like this, and we can't be in this community. So we appreciate you coming here and buying your books from us. And if, as a little thank you, if anyone did not get a raffle ticket, we came across a copy of Ferris Beach from 1990, an ARC, an old advanced reader copy. So if anyone would like a little, an extra copy of that, kind of as a special prize, and did not get a raffle ticket, just let me know and I can give you one. Okay, great. I've actually purchased 2 raffle tickets this week for other things because I'm feeling lucky. So who knows? Did anyone else not get one of my? There you go. One more over here. Any other takers for our raffle tickets? Okay, I'll do the drawing after the talk, and then we're going to move the signing line around 5 o'clock to the main part of the store. We have a table ready for Jill. So I'm going to do my introduction now, and then we'll move on to our discussion. Jill McCorkle has the distinction of having published her first 2 novels on the same day in 1984, and has gone on to publish 5 other novels, most recently Hieroglyphics, and 4 collections of short stories. 5 of her books have been named New York Times Notable Books, and 4 of her stories have appeared in Best American Short Stories. McCorkle has received the New England Booksellers Award, the John Dos Passos Prize for Excellence in Literature, the North Carolina Award for Literature, and the Thomas Wolfe Prize. She was recently inducted into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame. McCorkle has taught at Harvard, Brandeis, and North Carolina State, where she remains affiliated with the MFA program in creative writing, and she is core faculty in the Bennington Writing Seminars. She is talking today with her editor, Kathy Pories, is an executive editor at Algonquin Books. She has worked with numerous talented writers, and they have been winners and finalists for numerous awards, including the National Book Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Kirkus Prize, and the Carnegie Mellon Prize. She loves pencils, and she received her PhD in English Literature from the University of North Carolina here in Chapel Hill. So thank you, Kathy, for coming to speak with Jill, and let's hear what they have to say. Thank you. I'm walking off with the mic.
I'm so glad to be here. And can you all hear me? Is this kind of works?
I can turn it up a bit.
Yeah. I'm a soft talker. And I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm really grateful for Flyleaf for scheduling this when the weather got in the way, and making Jill have 2 events in one day, which as I started to think about it, it's kind of, it feels like a nice throwback to how you publish 2 books together, right? So maybe this is how it was supposed to be all along. And I was, when Shannon Ravenel retired, she had worked with Jill through many books, many years. There were some of her, Shannon's authors, who we did not know whether they would stay or they would go. And I was fully prepared for Jill to go, just because you have to think about those things. So it was a long struggle, and I was like, I have to keep it to myself. She's going to make the decision that feels right to her, and I'm so glad to say that she stayed, and I got to work with her. She's just I just consider you such a master, and I feel so honored that I get to work with you on your stories and all of your novel as well. So I just kind of wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Am I working? No, and what a great pleasure, because and Shannon would be the first to say it, and just a smooth transition for me, and a very positive one. So thank you. I feel really lucky.
I do feel very lucky to get to work with you. And in particular, I've just worked on hieroglyphics before this, and then I got to work on these stories. And what I loved, and there's not much work to do on Jill's work. That's all I have to say, because it comes in so beautifully. And I love how these stories, each one stayed with me. They felt like compact little novels, 12 little novels. That's kind of how I think of them, because the characters are so full. And I feel like each one is a deep dive into the people's lives, and there's small accidental choices or old crimes that determine so much of what comes after in their lives and how things unfold in really unplanned ways. And then I was thinking about the haunting epigraph to your collection, which is maybe, I'm going to say it wrong, maybe all that one can do is to end up, so I did. Wow. Maybe all one can do is hope to end up with the right regrets. And it's such a great epigraph. And as the Kirkus Review put it, the cost of past mistakes is often regret or even rage. The past is never too far from the present. That's what they said in their start review of the collection. And I feel like this is one of the major strands all the way through, in which for all of these characters, their pasts are their present. Their past lives live in their present life. And so that led me to wonder, did you conceive of all of these stories being in this collection? Did you write them with the idea that they would all be coming together?
I did not. 4 of them had been published on their own first, and then the other ideas sort of came while I was working on actually the past 2 novels. So a lot of times, I get an idea for a story and just sketch it and put it aside in a box. And what I have found over time is when I do that, whatever's in the box, they start to form a relationship with one another. It's like incubating a litter of something. And I really think that, I think my process is much more the process of a novelist, so that there's this overarching theme even as you're working in the smaller pieces. And I always wanted to write stories and did not feel accomplished with the form. And so between novels, I would come back to the story. And what has happened over time is that my novels have become more fragmented and my stories have started to connect thematically. And so when I finally finished the cluster, and one of them, and there 2 actually were ideas that were very old. One had probably been in the box about 8 years, and another one 20 years. And, I think sometimes we get ideas and we're just not ready to write that story. And so when I came back and started working on those, I started to see how they might be related to some of those earlier stories. And then we had the great pleasure of wonderful conversations about what would be the overarching structure of how the order of the stories. Yeah. And as a result, there were some changes made to those that had already been published. Just slight tweaks and strands woven in so that they did connect more fully.
Is it a literal box?
Sometimes it's like a grocery store bag. It depends, usually it's a drawer.
Yeah.
And And you know, it's fun, and the longer I keep this stash of notes, the more surprised I am when I go in there because I'm like, oh, I forgot about that one. And putting the pieces together.
And I just, one more follow-up to that. Which one was the oldest idea that you said was from 20 years?
Filling station.
Filling station, oh, yeah. Which is so interesting because that's so connected to the others.
I think it's an idea of a character in a situation that I often start with, and it's the story of a man who on the surface has it all together. You know, he's got the family, the big house, the business, but when he drives out into the country, he passes by daily the house where his grandparents once lived, which has now been turned into like a convenience store, kind of / gas station. But there's still that upstairs room that he knew as a child. And I have always been fascinated by those little rooms over businesses. I love the Elizabeth Bishop poem, Filling Station, you know, that ends with the line, somebody loves us all, where you see tires and SO and whatnot, but then you see a doily and a sleeping cat and a whole life there. But I could never get him beyond, you know, he would imagine going back into that space as a boy. And that's as far as I could get him for years. And it was kind of like I would just hit the dead end. But I kept him because I really wanted to revisit. And then in the story, as soon as I had him go in and start talking to the woman who was working there, it started moving again.
So he, in your early version, he hadn't moved in up there. He hadn't rented it. It's a great story. I wanted to turn to the title story, Old Crimes, which speaks to so much in the collection, and it is the title story. Did I just repeat myself? I might have. And this is a story of Lynn, who's on a getaway weekend with Cal, who is her boyfriend at the time. And they end up in a very rundown motel. No, I won't say too much, except that there is the appearance of a belt. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read everything yet, but that is why there's a belt on the cover, which is something.
Thanks to you for getting the belt on the cover.
I like the idea of a menacing belt in the shadow box. And I would wish you would just talk about this story and also read from it.
Sure. This story also grew out of just the image of a place, kind of one of those rundown family inns that's not what it's advertised to be. So should I just start and read? I think it'll. Old Crimes. It was June 1999, and they were at a family inn in New Hampshire. It was not the romantic weekend spot Lynn had imagined when Cal invited her for a quick getaway between sessions of summer school. Being together and time away, he had said, that's what we need, right? Lynn nodded, even though she was not feeling the togetherness at the moment, just the away, out in the middle of the woods in an old farmhouse with a prefab wing of rooms like a rundown motel. The walls were covered in dark paneling and there was a faded floral bedspread, shades too small for the windows, and a 40-watt bulb in the one lamp on the dresser. The food in the dining room was family style with very little choice. The room filled with trinkets and little wooden signs everywhere. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Bless this mess. And in the bathroom, we aim to please, you aim to please. There were tattered pinwheels and Pepsi bottles on the tables, a Kewpie doll by the cash register, and things she had not seen in years, like pastel-colored rocks growing in a fishbowl, a dried-up sea monkey container, and a Cabbage Patch doll dressed up like a sailor. There were more toothpick holders than she had ever seen gathered in one place, and something about it all, the early American decor, eagle decals everywhere, and empty bird feeders, all the stuff, left her feeling like life had slowed, clicking like a dying engine, and then stopped. Needless to say, they were not partying and celebrating the end of the century, as Prince had promised they would be doing back in the 80s, when they were kids growing up hundreds of miles apart. Him in a cushioned, suburban, well-educated life in the Northeast, where things like the right schools were always at the forefront, and her maneuvering the backside of the Bible Belt with all the baggage and guilt often inherent in that. No expectations of anything beyond high school graduation until the guidance counselor, barely out of college herself, insisted Lynn try. "You have choices," the young woman kept saying. "You can go anywhere." Lynn had met Cal out in front of her dorm the day she moved in. That was over a year ago, and he would be graduating soon. Although on break, both had brought a stack of books along for the weekend. He was studying to take the LSAT, and she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do in life, but knew he would be more impressed if she also had a stack of books. She was barely 20 and thought it was mean that her college advisor was saying she had to declare a major, something that he also said would affect the rest of her life. The high school guidance counselor had made it all sound so simple, and it was anything but. Still, she had taken a lot of courses she found interesting, even when her grades didn't reflect it. She had taken one in forensic archaeology and another in ethics, and the two together had left her thinking of all the many mysteries that remain unsolved and perhaps always will, not to even mention all that remains unknown and buried under ice and volcanic rock, in peat bogs and the greatest depths of the ocean. On a whim, she had taken a creative writing class, even though her advisor kept saying that her chosen courses were not leading toward anything, and that if she didn't buckle down, she would not be able to graduate in 4 years, and her financial aid would likely not be extended. His voice sometimes sounded like a lawnmower in her head, muffling anything from past or present that sounded like a reprimand or a judgment. She had had enough reprimands and judgments to last a lifetime. Besides, she was the first in her family to even go to college, so whatever happened, she had at least done something. She had made that choice. That was what she told herself at the end of each day. She made a B in the class, some good ideas, but nothing thought through, the professor said. But she had continued to think about one of the exercises that was assigned at the end of the term. Pick an object. Pick a place where that object exists. Imagine a person in that place with the object. Then they were supposed to imagine a different person in that place with the object, and then another and another. How many variations, different characters, different situations, different stories might evolve? It was amazing how something so simple could quickly become complicated. She chose a belt because in her archaeology class, she had already been assigned to track something through the ages that people take for granted. At first, she had wanted to do hats because she loved hats of all kinds, even though too self-conscious to wear them, and was inspired by that one famous bog body on the cover of one of her assigned books, The Tolland Man, ancient and frozen and wearing a little pointed cap, a detail so simple and personal that it filled her with sadness. But when she began researching it all in the library, the history of the hat quickly became a lot more complicated, way more work than she wanted to do, though she never would have told Cal that. But the Tolland Man was also wearing a belt, and it seemed clear that was the easier pursuit, not to mention it offered far more action than the hats would have, the word alone suggesting action. A belt could be a song or a drink or a slap. The belt, looping and connecting since 3300 BCE, leather, suede, satin, and silk, rope, brass, cord, notched, cinched, buckled. It was a fashion statement, a utilitarian transport for tools and treasures, an object grown-ups could use to threaten children. It was a murder weapon, binding hands and feet or wrapping around the throat. A belt, a room, inside a room, behind a door, a man takes off his belt. That was her sentence. Who is the man? What is the situation? Is anyone else in the room? I'll stop there.
Just the way the belt, I mean, there's something about Lynn that, and this belt, that just, there's a sense of both sadness and menace. And I love how she's with Cal, but there's no sense of Cal with her, you know?
Yes. Much more attachment, I think, to these old crimes.
Yeah.
And also right after this, a little girl in foster care sort of appears at the door, eager to eat the chocolate by the bed and rummage her suitcase. So it goes in a very different direction.
That little girl is my favorite. Because the way she busts into the room and just takes over everything. So to back up a bit, just before this, and I guess we talked about this slightly. Is that me?
I don't know.
I think it's someone's phone.
Someone's honey.
Just before this, you published hieroglyphics, and I'm wondering if there's a different process to that was a beautiful novel, and as you said, it's also told in a kind of deliberately fragmented way. And a story collection does feel like such a different animal to create. How do you shift gears between a novel and story collection?
As I was saying, the whole time I'm working on a novel, I continue to have ideas for stories, sometimes thinking it's going to somehow find a place in the novel, but more often needing its own. And so that is when I just tend to stay with what I'm doing and save up the ideas.
So that, yeah, I guess that you're working on both at the same time is
in a certain way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is your 5th story collection. The previous ones, for people who don't know, and they're all great, is Crash Diet, Final Days, Creatures of Habit, and Going Away Shoes. And do you feel like your approach to stories has changed over time?
Yes, I think that my struggle with the story and wanting to be where I wanted to be, I think in the beginning I really thought I could save the scraps from a novel and they could be stories. And that was just so wrong. And in fact, I find that now I want just as much substance in an individual story as I might put in a novel, if that makes sense. The analogy that always came to me, and I don't know, it seems like it was in an Ann Tyler essay, or somebody used the image of like cutting a pie crust, you know, and like here's the good part and then all the scraps. And I think I was in that mode, the scrap mode, for a very long time. And then there was one story in particular, it's called Departures. I can't tell you which collection it's in. But when I wrote that story, it felt like I was on a different street. And then then a story called Intervention. And the same thing happened when I read that story. It felt like a different place. And it's hard to say what that place is exactly. But I was feeling more and more confident, I think.
So those stories did not come out of scraps? Is what
They
you're
did
saying?
not come out of scraps. They were ideas that I thought potentially could move in the direction of a novel.
And then you decided you wanted to make them stories. That makes sense because they do read very richly.
And I think, I often have told my students that I think the material often tells us what it is. I mean, like you don't just announce. I don't. I'm kind of superstitious that way, so I wait to see what it is.
Oh, you don't announce to yourself what
Yeah,
it's going to be, whether it's going to be a story or a novel.
Yeah, because sometimes what I have thought would be a novel just goes nowhere, and then I plug it in with what I thought was going to be a story and add, and so that person goes from having his own story to being a minor character, and then it works.
Well, that seems like a good segue to the other next story I'd love for you to read from, which is The Lineman.
Yeah. This is one of those stories that just literally began with the Glenn Campbell song. So I'll read the opening, and then I'm going to shift over and read a tiny bit beyond. The Lineman. I am a lineman for the county. It's true, and there was a time when Pam laughed when I said that, but now she just smirks and turns away. Now she monitors the time I spend with Amanda and counts the days until the divorce comes through. Whenever I pick Amanda up for dinner, a wave of teenage cologne and strange hair colors, there's yet another pasteboard box or torn grocery bag Pam has left on the steps with some of my belongings, old shaving cream, single socks, junk mail. She says she can't bear to see me. We once had an old retriever mix named Teeny, who, when caught spread eagle on the living room sofa, stared into the far corner as if we couldn't see her plump body because she couldn't see us. We laughed at it then. Even Pam, who was not a dog person and got angry about her shedding in the living room, had laughed and marveled at Teeny's sweet passive attempt to make us disappear. Pulling a Teeny, I almost said the other day, when I arrived early and caught her off guard, my mother's old jewelry box and a t-shirt I hadn't worn in over a decade in her hand. The last time I tried to make light of her ignoring my presence, she said I repulsed her. Somehow she has managed to take her affair and turn herself into the victim. It's not easy to cross those lines up, but she has become a pro. I almost said that, but then thought better because Amanda was standing right there, 14, and so easy for me to lose right about now. Her hair had a bright blue streak that day, like in the comic books, and her boots looked like the ones I wear on the job. The lines are still important, I had told Pam when it was clear she'd lost interest in everything about me. The lines aren't what's eating everybody up with cancer. I love that song, Wichita Lineman, and have since the first time I heard Glenn Campbell singing it in 1968 when I was only 12 years old. I read in an interview where the guy who wrote the song saw somebody out in Oklahoma way up a pole working all by himself and said it was the picture of loneliness. That phrase, picture of loneliness, has stuck with me all these years, coming to mind when I see a certain look cross a person's face, the look my mama often had when she thought no one was watching her. I'm going to skip over a little. He has the mother at one end, the daughter at the other, the divorce in the middle. But throughout the story, there are his meditations on his job and how things have changed. Did I say how there used to be silence? And now I'm wondering what people are going to do when the big blow comes, when all the lines are knocked out and the generators fail, and we're turned back to a day guided by nothing but the sun and the moon. Do you know how to read a clock face? Have you memorized addresses and phone numbers? Do you know how to read a map? I ask Amanda, who sometimes listens but most times doesn't. I say how it used to be a person actually had to get up and walk to one place in the house to answer the phone, that it was tethered there to the wall with cords and a plug that slid neatly into a jack that people like me came and installed. You had to get up off your ass to change the channel, too. Sometimes you had to put tinfoil on rabbit ears and twist your body this way and that to pick up one of the 3 channels available in our area. The phone was a separate entity itself, a station, a fixture, not an appendage to interrupt you 10 million times a day. My old mama had a chair built into a little table that was just for the telephone. You had a dictionary on the shelf, too, to look up something you didn't know. People had things like World Book. My old mama didn't have anything but Funkin' Wagnalls, and I was jealous of the World Book crowd. First thing I did as a married man with a baby coming was to go out and buy a set. And Pam, who had just started taking classes at the university, looked at me like I was a fool. Of course you got a good buy, she yelled. Amanda, who we just called the baby at the time, filling her abdomen. It's like buying dinosaur food. Where have you been, Ricky? That was when she still called me Ricky, which I'd been called my whole life. It was right before she got it in her head that I might fit in better if we called me Rick, or even Rich, or Richard. But my name isn't Richard, I told her, it's Ricky. On my birth certificate it says Ricky. And don't ask me why my mama chose to just go with Ricky. For all I know, it was because of Ricky damn Ricardo, but that's just the way it is. Maybe somewhere out there is a guy named Ricky who fathered me, but that's something I'll probably never hear about. Where have you been, Rick? She said I had taken a wrong turn and missed the information highway altogether. And that has been her line for me ever since, especially once she went from adjunct to professor and really found her place there with the digital crowd and their little Friday afternoon gatherings at an outdoor cafe where they say things nobody else on the planet can possibly understand. It's the buzz and the wires and the wind up in the trees, and yes, I am left behind in an expansive desert without even the poles and lines to mark the miles. And yes, that is lonely. You have missed the information highway altogether, Rick. Not altogether, I told her, about the same time everything blew up. I know things. In fact, I had begun following her by then, and I did know things. Now I tell Amanda that she needs to learn how to wait and be patient. Be still and know. Somebody famous said that, and if I still had my world books, I might be able to say who. Be still and know. Or maybe it's from the Bible. Pretty sure it's either Walt Whitman, Confucius, or God. I don't Google, so you'll just have to take my word for it. There was a time we had a turntable with speakers the size of small coffins. We had one phone in the kitchen and an extension in the bedroom and only had to dial 5 digits. I grew up with 5 digits, and we didn't go to 7 until I was in high school. The rotary made a nice sound and allowed time to concentrate between numbers, like the sound at the end of an album before the needle is lifted. There was a time when we had silence. It was so quiet, you could hear what someone said.
I just love that man, and he doesn't feel so distant from how I feel about a lot of things.
Same. he grew out of that desire.
It's amazing how this portrait of him being totally alone in a world where everybody's trying to connect with each other all the time, but they're not actual connections.
Right.
Yeah.
And the whole story is about communication. And I think a lot of the stories, that is a thematic thread running through the communication between characters and also between generations. And just different eras.
Totally different eras. Yeah. But that does also bring me to this idea. You do have a few characters in the collection that reappear in other stories, but you do it in such a discreet way that it's possible to read the whole collection and someone might miss that they are the same characters. So I wondered why you chose to do it that way instead of, say, in a more overt way.
You know, I went back and forth on it, and as you know, we even pulled strings a little tighter in certain places and loosened them in others. I wanted you to, if you recognized it, great, but I also wanted the feeling of a kind of universal connection, that if it wasn't that person exactly, it was someone very similar in a different orbit, participating in life in a similar way.
Yeah.
Because I think it, or I hope the threads really are about people sort of coming to a place of recognition or acceptance, some doing it better than others, but a kind of acknowledgement of truth or the way things are. And so for me, by not pinning it down every step of the way to specific people in a specific place, I hoped it would make the world seem bigger.
I think it does, and as a reader, it's kind of a wonderful surprise when Lynn in Old Crimes reappears near the end of the collection, and it, at first you don't know that, and then you're like, oh, that's Lynn. You know,
Yeah.
I love that, and William.
And for me, the biggest surprise was seeing whether people recognize or not a character from a story called Low Tones. I suddenly realized she was the same woman in another story.
Yeah.
And that was the moment that sort of led me back to see how they were overlapping. And sometimes it's just, it's a very subtle overlap. I mean, the lineman has a memory of his rehearsal dinner in a particular seafood restaurant where people over the years have randomly tossed things into the big aquarium. So, you know, there are all kinds of keys and lost objects tossed into this big aquarium. And he recalls the little bride and groom, you know, tossed in. And someone else in another story makes mention of the aquarium. You know, so sometimes it's just that object that connects.
But with Loris and Low Tones, she's such an interesting character, just thinking about her. And she uses her hearing issues as a way to kind of give herself a kind of safety.
Silence.
Yeah.
There's a lot of silence in there.
Let's see. I think I have one time for one more question, and then I should open it up for
Okay.
all of your questions. One thing in here is that there are teachers in a lot of the
Oh, yes,
stories.
yes.
There's Alton in Low Tones, and Alton's an interesting character. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but he's a shop teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Vera, who's a drama teacher in Act 3. And then there's a woman in Commandments who's a teacher. And then in Simple Question, both Anna and Muriel are teachers. So,
And an elementary school librarian.
oh, right, and a librarian, yes.
Well, they are in many ways. I mean, I see teachers and librarians as heroes, and particularly in those early years, you know, I find it intriguing what the right book at the right time can do for a kid. The right words from a teacher early that stay. And I always, my personal story with that is a third grade teacher who really, there was a lot she did we did not like at all. Like she didn't like kickball or boys and girls chasing one another. You know, we had to do breathing exercises and things that we hated and plant bulbs. But she loved drawing and she loved writing. And my favorite thing about her is every class had to pick a song at the end of the year. And the song she picked for us was I Left My Heart in San Francisco. And to hear a chorus of 8-year-olds singing Tony Bennett. And I remember, you know, at the time I didn't think anything of it except she gave us a dud song every day, you know. And now I look back and think, where was that taking her, you know? But anyway, she was big on creative writing, and I got to school one morning in 3rd grade, and I remember on the main bulletin board of the school, she had taken one of my poems and like matted it and put my name, you know, she typed it up and my name was under it, and she hadn't told me, you know. And I just have this strong memory of standing there, you know, like with my book sack and lunch bag. I think I saw my name in print, never got over it. You know, and I really credit her with, you know, sort of giving me that stroke at just the right time, because I never got over it. And I think teachers really have that power, and I'm just a big fan of teachers and librarians doing what they do. So yeah, I mean, I probably have too many teachers in here, but it tends to be the job I often like to give them.
Yeah, it's interesting what everyone takes away from a teacher.
Well, it also opens up the whole field of what that person is teaching. Mm-hmm. Like Lynn went on to teach history. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this interest in the Eid girl and the Talon man. You know, more important than Cal, right? And you know, and later the character Vera has taught high school drama for years, and so many of her references are to plays, and she describes segments of life as if it's a scene. So.
Great story. I was hoping you could read from it, but I don't want to take
if
questions.
We'll do.
So, if anyone has any questions for Jill, yes.
So this is a collection of short stories. So how do you decide the order to put them in the book?
So the question is about how the order, and Kathy and I did a lot of talking back and forth on the order. And because there were these threads linking some of them, that became an important part. I've always liked to sort of think of it as like building a card house where you gotta have, I guess a house with, so something strong on either end and supportive in the middle. And so we sort of decided beginning and ending. That felt pretty obvious. And then the rest, you don't want two voices that sound too similar back to back. So we had a whole list of things. And I mean, Kathy, and Kathy's the one, for a long time I thought the title would be Low Tones. And Kathy's the one who said, no, I think it's Old Crimes. Yeah. And as soon as she said it, I knew she was right.
I mean, sometimes the answers are all right there. It's just, it was Old Crimes. I think that's what was its title, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How do you balance your time between your own writing and then the teaching that you do? Like, do you focus on one and then the other? Do they have synergies with each other?
Yeah, the question is about balancing teaching and writing. They feel like totally different channels, and I've now taught for almost 40 years, and I'm kind of pulling away. But over the years, especially when juggling a full-time load, I found that my ability to read and edit was on the same channel as my teaching brain, so I would try to designate the time for writing that could be just completely clean and removed from everything else. Which, anyone working full-time or family who wants to write, I mean, it's hard. I never knew how much you could do in 15 minutes until I had children. But suddenly, every little block of time becomes something. And it's shifted over the years, depending. But I find even an hour devoted to just looking over those notes or writing longhand can be very productive.
So you still write longhand? Yeah.
I write longhand in the beginning a lot, and then come to and it's a mess, and the real writing happens on the keyboard. I always want to say typewriter. The world of the lineman, but yeah.
So I'm fascinated and intrigued by, clearly you are well-read, so how you keep original ideas and not get them sort of polluted by other things you're reading. But then you're saying, I was so surprised as I was writing this that, I realized this character was the same character. So there's clearly so much originality. I don't even know what my question is. It's sort of, could you comment on how is that just a writer's brain that I don't have? And it's intriguing to me, or?
Well, when I am really inside a novel, working on it, I find it very hard to be reading novels. And I tend to read nonfiction or poetry. I can read like a short story, something you can absorb and put down and come back. But it's very hard for me to be in those two different worlds. And so, I do get those surprises as a writer. One of my favorite stories about that is the writer Larry Brown, a good friend of mine, who once, when I first met him, and Larry was an Algonquin writer for years, but I had just met him, and he said, well, I just wrote this story. I'd love for you to read it. And I said, okay. And we had just met, and a few minutes later, there's a knock on my hotel room, and he said, well, here's the story. And I said, oh, well, good. I'm looking forward. I take the story. He comes in, he sits down. I said, oh, you want me to read it right now? And he said, yeah, well, if you don't mind. And so I was reading it, and it was this really scary scene of this almost monster type character chained up in a basement, and the parents are trying to force this man to heal him, and it's really dark and scary. And I'm reading, and I'm like, wow. And Larry reached over and grabbed my arm, and he said, I know, can you believe it? And I always like to tell that story because it so illustrates that kind of surprise, you know, that when the creatures are on the page and start moving, I think if you spend enough time getting to know who these characters are, it would be like if you chose people from your life and put them in a situation, you would know what they would say, you know, 9 out of 10 times. So it's like that. Yes?
I've often heard it said that the short story is the most difficult form of fiction to perfect and to write a good and effective short story, for I guess obvious reasons. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, if you agree with that, if you find it more challenging to make a complete universe in a short piece.
I do. I find it more challenging. What, you know, and it gets said a million times, and it gets, you know, was it Mark Twain or Thoreau, but whoever said I would have written you a shorter letter if I'd had more time. and so it's like that, and I'm going to misquote Faulkner, but it was something like, everybody wants to be a poet, and then you fail and you write stories, and then you fail and you write novels, you know. I mean, novels are more forgiving, you know. There can be some flab in there, and nobody's going to pay much attention to it, and it gets harder and harder.
Think about Moby Dick and the sperm whale.
But, you know, for me, that has been the challenge of the form, but it's also a form I really love. I love to read plays, which is another animal altogether. But very satisfying.
Yeah, so there's like a certain rhythm to your like speaking in your lines. I was just curious, like how you construct the sentence, like in terms of in comparison to the whole story, and also like each individual word, like what sort of process that is for you.
The construction of sentences and word, you know, that's something that sometimes it comes out right. A lot of times it's the process of revision. And revision is my favorite part of it all. And I really love punctuation. And I love the M dash. I love the semicolon, you know, and they can help you travel far in one paragraph. And so there's that challenge. But oftentimes that comes during the revision process. I have a sloppy habit in a rough draft of just almost doing dash, 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 you know, just to get it out there. And sometimes on a good day, when things are going very quickly, it's easier for me to follow the plot, follow the story, and know that that I can then come back and work with the sentences. The wonderful writer Daphne Athos, who many of you here in Chapel Hill know well, she is missed, but she so wrote by her ear and sense of language. And Michael, I may be misquoting her, but I remember her telling a story one time, something about she would be writing a sentence and she knew needed a word, but she couldn't think of it. So she would just type something with the same syllables. So I remember her saying that, like, she might type her cauliflower laughter, came from the room or something, and had screwed up a couple of times and forgotten to go back and take it out. So, but I totally understand that. It's like hearing the rhythm. Yes.
Was intentionally crafting a collection of stories? How was that different from writing stories and then having them collected after the fact? Did you know going in that you were going to want to use two already published stories? And did you write any stories that weren't then included? Or was there more of almost an outline to the construction of the book? Was it more like writing a novel?
I didn't know for sure, that the ones that had been published earlier would in fact fit. I had hoped they would. And in this case, they all did. I've had other collections where I had stories that did not go in. I remember one collection that I worked on years ago with Shannon Ravenel. I had one story from the point of view of a man surrounded by these really very talkative women. And Shannon is like, this guy is just, drowning. He just doesn't belong here. And I trusted her on that.
Oh, you mean the other stories were talkative women?
Yeah.
I thought in the story he was swimming.
No. but in this case, they all did find a place. But I think when I was writing the 4 that had already been published, I was not thinking of the collection at that time. I think that really kicked into gear when I had the drafts of all these others.
Question for Kathy. Do you, when you're editing, do you have in mind a number of stories that is a good number for a collection? Or clearly it depends on how many have been written or what sources you're getting them from, but is there any sort of magic formula that you could,
No.
It has to be at least 10 or something?
No, really, I feel like the writer knows better than I do, how many stories should be in there. When we talked about form, it was really just, Jill must have sent me 4 different, I think you had 4 different ideas of how to structure it, and we just kind of played with that. But yeah, no, I never, I've worked on a couple of story collections, Jill's and Michael's story collections, and I know there are more I'm forgetting right now, Rebecca Lee's, and they're all just different numbers. I can't even tell you how many stories are in each one, but that's a good question.
Just as you said that writing a short story is more challenging in some ways than writing a novel, I find that reading a short story is more challenging than reading a novel. And I often come to the end of a short story and it leaves me unsettled almost. I don't quite know how it's ending or what. I have to complete it in my mind. My question is, how do you define a short story versus a novel or novella?
Well, I think you've made a very good point about that reading. I think in many ways the story is closer kin to a poem than a novel. And again, a novel gives you a lot more space to sort of relax into it. And a lot of times with a story, you get to the end and you recognize, and then you want to go back and see how it played out. I've often said to my students, for me, the ideal reading experience of a story is you get to the end and you both gasp in a kind of surprise or relief or whatever, and in that same moment you see all the steps of logic that led you to that place, if that makes sense. But you don't always see the steps as you're reading. There's one more right there, Kathy. I have no idea what we're doing on time.
Oh, I guess we might have time for 2 more
But
questions.
she's a writer, and I want to hear from her.
I had a question about character and how you go about developing your characters, and I know you talked about surprises and how they sometimes take their own journey. But what do you think is the most important parts to establish about a character before you start writing them? Like, what do you need to know to make sure that they are distinct from their voice?
Very good question about what I need to know about a character. I believe if I know what that character loves more than anything else, and if I know what stands to wound or weaken that person, I think sometimes those are the cards we hold closest and protect. And so for me as a writer, if I just start out knowing or I know what this person regrets or some memory that haunts. I often in class have told my students to the point that we now refer to it as if it's not one thing, it's your mother. Because believe it or not, there are so many times I read a story and I know something's missing, and if I say to that person, what do you know about this guy's mother? You know, very often there's something that sort of clicks. So sometimes it's a father, but more often a mother.
Should we end there, or did I don't know what our time. I think yes.
Could I ask one follow-up to that? I was wondering about the characters too, but just how you sort of create their different voices, and if you're making efforts to kind of have different language or a different sound.
Yes, and we are, and that's something in the revision process that you're not thinking about when you're writing stories that are going to have an independent life. But when you put them all in the collection, then suddenly you don't want to overdo. And to, use the same phrases or, things that make them sound the same.
I just had one quick question. Talking about the character, how do you decide about point of view? Does the point of view that you tell your story come from the character that you get to know, or when do you make that decision about what the point of view of the story will be?
The question is about point of view, and I love this question because I love focusing on point of view, and many times I will flip it, and a lot of times I will write a character in first person knowing I'm going to flip it because I need the broader camera, but I want the sensation of the voice that you get in first person. And for me, it's just a trick that works. And so a lot of times, tense, is it present? Is it past? Is it first person? Is it third? I often go back and forth. And sometimes it hits the page and it's right. But other times I find myself working and it keeps pulling to be in past tense. And I learned a long time ago that when there is this natural pull, I'm better off to go with it.
Thank you so much. Jill, exciting book.
Take one of those and announce our wrap.
I've got to get this copy.
Yes, we're going to move to the main part of the store over by the fiction section. We're going to make a line to sign the book. If you have any mobility issues, though, and you need to kind of move to the front of the line, just flag me down and I'll make sure that you get your book signed up early. Right now I'm going to draw the raffle ticket for the copy of Ferris Beach. And here we go. This is so exciting. All right. So look on your ticket, and if you have number 378722, is that yours?
No, I missed it by 2.
378722. Right here, first seat in the front row. Yay! And she has a stack of books too, so went to the right person. All right. Well, thank y'all so much. And if you want to make your way out to the main room, we're going to organize the signing line now.
Excuse me, I'm just kind of.
Hi, thank you, Kathy, for your great question.